This is episode number 123, featuring David Dibble.
This is the PleinAir podcast with Eric Rhodes, publisher and founder of PleinAir magazine. In the PleinAir podcast, we cover the world of outdoor painting. Called PleinAir, the French coined the term, which means open air or outdoors. The French pronounce it plein air. Others say plain air. No matter how you say it, there is a huge movement of artists around the world who are going outdoors to paint. And this show is about that movement. Now, here's your host, author, publisher, and painter, Eric Rhodes.
Thank you, announcer Jim Kipping, and welcome to the PleinAir podcast. Man, I love this time of year, spring and then summer, and I hope it's spring where you are or getting to be. And this summer, I'm going to be doing summer camp for artists. I love it because, like, when I was a kid, I went to YMCA and Boy Scout camp, got to make lots of campfires, lots of friends, got to go back year after year and see the same friends. So I decided to do summer camp for artists. Instead of having workshops and demos and all that stuff, I just wanted to play every day. And so everybody just comes and paints for a week. It's called the Publishers Invitational, and it's in the Adirondack Mountains, upstate New York, about, we're maybe 30, 40 minutes from the Canadian border. It's really beautiful up there, very mountainous and gorgeous scenery, beautiful, beautiful trees. Anyway, it's incredible. And it's going to be a week of painting. It's open to about 100 people. I don't take any more than that because it's just too much to manage. And we're about halfway there already. So come on up to the Adirondacks in June. It's the week before Father's Day, and we're done. You can be home for Father's Day, and it's a well-deserved break. You can learn more about it at publishersinvitational.com. I'll be there. It'll be fun. Coming up after the interview, I'm going to be answering some art marketing questions. But first, let's get right to the interview. Really good responses from David Dibble, great painter. David Dibble, welcome to the PleinAir podcast.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the invitation.
Oh, man, the honor is all ours. We are so excited to talk to you. Your work just blows everything away. It's just so fantastic. And I'm a little bit of a groupie, I've got to admit. I'm a big fan of your work, and you've got, a lot of, as I flip around on your website, which is dibbleart.com, I see a lot of variety in terms of the sense of feeling and style, but your compositions are second to none. I mean, they're just fantastic, and your sense of light, your color, just everything about them. I like the fact that you've done good editing in the sense that you put what's necessary in, the compositions draw you in, but you don't overdo it. So I encourage everybody to go to your website, daviddibble.com, and check it out. So how did this all begin for you, David? I don't know your story.
Oh, boy. Well, I mean, like all artists, right, it's not a straight path. It's kind of circuitous. But I grew up on a farm in Davis County, Utah, and I think just from a young age, I was in nature alone, right? Like I'd wander the fields without supervision when I was a little kid, and just really grew a sense of connection to nature in that way, as well as agriculture. And so I went to a variety of schools, finished up a bachelor in illustration at BYU, Brigham Young University, and then Academy of Art University for an MFA in San Francisco. And then my wife and I went to New York for her grad school in dance, and then ended up getting a job for me at Blue Sky Studios that was part of 20th Century Fox at the time. Now Disney owns it, and worked on films such as Rio and Ferdinand and Peanuts and some Ice Age films, things like that. And that was a fantastic training ground. And then I was invited to come teach illustration at BYU. And here I am again, back in Utah in the shadow of the Wasatch Mountains. So it's been a fun trip. Well,
it's certainly a beautiful area. We were saying before we started recording that I lived out in Provo, Utah. Started a radio station out there and lived there for a lot of years. And I was not a painter. I was a photographer at the time, but I could just kick myself because I've never had a chance to paint out there. And, I just have all my favorite spots that I would do photographs, and now I want to go back and paint them. So you may find me showing up on one day and inviting you to go painting with me.
Well, please do. We've got a spare bedroom. It's all yours. But I think there's a reason that you see so many landscape painters just in the West in general, but here in Utah as well. There's a really strong contingent of them from, Brian Mark Taylor and Josh Clare, Alvin Muselka, Mike Malm. I mean, there's John Poon. There's so many out here. So it's a great place for that.
So why do you think that is? Is it was one thing driving it? Was the beauty of the landscape driving it? Was it because of a particular, a school, or did it have something to do with Mormon culture? Why are there so many artists out there?
Oh boy, I think it's a variety of things. I think certainly the landscape is that there's a strong cultural center here, but I think you're also right that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints has a strong emphasis on representational art and image making as a form of worship, in the sense of helping people connect to God's creations through art has been part from the very beginning. In fact, my third great-grandfather came across the plains with those early Mormon pioneers and helped to establish one of the first art museums in this area. So it's from the very beginning, it's been, I think, a really important part. And early on, actually, the church sent missionaries to Paris to learn how to paint in the classical tradition, so they could come back and use those skills as part of the cultural enrichment for church buildings in the area. So
I did not know that. Do you know who those artists would have been?
Yeah, John Hafen and some others of the time. It was at the turn of the century, late 1800s, and it's fun to see pictures of them in Paris at the Studio Julien and other academies and things, learning how to paint. And Brigham Young called them on as art missionaries to go and learn how to paint.
I had never heard that. So I'm curious about museums. You mentioned your great grandfather or three generations back or something started a museum.
Right.
What was that?
Right. It was the Springville Art Museum.
Oh, what a fabulous museum. My favorite restaurant in town is a little restaurant called La Casita right across the street from it.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So he put his cane in the ground and one day and said, someday there's going to be a great institution of artistic learning here, and others helped jump in and make that a reality. And so in fact, he wasn't a painter himself, but he did take a series of big murals around of the artists had done and went from small town to town back in that early pioneer time, and would give lectures on the early history of the church back in the early back east and Midwest and things that he had experienced. And so again, a really early art tradition in the area.
Interesting. Well, that's a great little museum. It's as a matter of fact, it's a gem. And
it is.
It is. I mean, it's destination worthy. In other words, it's not just the kind of museum that you would just go to if you happen to be driving through the area. It's a museum that you'd get on an airplane to go see.
Oh yeah, Vern Swanson and others really helped make it a world-class destination. Some of the best collections of Russian Impressionism in the U.S., frankly, are there in that museum.
Yeah, I'm curious.
So it really is a pretty amazing place.
I think I'll invite Vern to be on the PleinAir podcast sometime, but I'm curious about why Russian Museum in the middle of Springville, Utah, which is kind of halfway between Salt Lake City and Provo.
Yeah. Well, from the little I understand, I know little bits of the story, but basically it was just right as Russia was opening up after the fall of communism, and Vern knew a lot about the artwork and went over and just was in a position to make some acquisitions. And at a time when they were maybe representational art wasn't as valued there in the area as it is now during some of the nationalistic revival. So I think they were willing to kind of let it go out of the country in ways that maybe they're not now. So
well, there was so much of it at the time. Vern and a few others. There's a guy in Minneapolis whose name escapes me who did the same thing, and they just went in there and they They just brought so much out. Another guy in Tennessee, they just brought volumes and volumes of Russian art into America before the Russians had really realized that these things were national treasures. Now they're trying to get a lot of it back. It's become very valuable, and so that's interesting.
Yeah, well, I think it's also true that we in the U.S. just didn't know a lot about it for so many years. We were only allowed to see Russia as an enemy, and nothing good could come out of that culture. And yet there's artists there to rival anything produced in the West. It's just an amazing tradition, and it's really cool actually to see how art kind of went from Impressionism in Paris and went to Russia and then to the U.S. and then went from Russia to China and from China now back to the U.S. and start to see these cycles of our heritage that you can really connect stylistically. It's really exciting.
Yeah, well, the Cultural Revolution in China, they imported all these great artists from Russia to teach them. And I'm a big Russophile. It's not very popular like Russia these days for whatever reason, but it's, I only care about the art and the people that I know over there who are so wonderful. And, they kept these things alive. There's an interesting story about Joseph Stalin. Even though he was a horrific man, he did a lot of things for art. And he realized, there's a great book on this. I can't remember the name of it. I'll try to find it for you. But he realized that art had a lot to do with culture and control of people. And he did not, his enemies were promoting modern art, which was happening back in the 30s and 40s and 20s, 30s and 40s. And he made a conscious effort to promote realism or representational art. And they made sure that the artists continued to be trained in the processes that had been handed down through lineage. And then as you say, the Impressionists, they became some of the best Impressionists in the world. And as a result, we have this wonderful culture of artists. I have lots of friends over there. I've been over there, painted many times, and it's just a phenomenal experience. I'm going to take a group over there one day. I think I'll do that. I just thought of that, but I think you should come. Anyway, this isn't about me. So let's go back to. I know I tend to go off on these tangents. I apologize. So let's go back to so you went to school in Italy. You didn't mention that, but I saw that on your resume. Was that because you were living in Italy? You were on a mission? What was that story?
So I did serve as a missionary for the church down in Brazil, but then my parents were serving, kind of running the missionary operations in northeastern Italy during that same time. And so I went to live with them for a year after my time in Brazil, and ended up going to an art school there in Venice for a year. And it was really great. I didn't speak a lot of Italian, and so I just could kind of look and see what was going on. But it was just even a chance to explore in the area, to become more culturally literate. And I think like everyone that goes through school, you see more than you can process, and in the years since I've realized, I saw that and I was around all this amazing work, and I just didn't really have the visual tools to process it at the time. I knew it was cool, but I just didn't understand it as much. So I loved it. It was fantastic. And it was good to come back and then get some kind of stronger training, traditional training here, to then start to access some of that knowledge and move forward artistically. But yeah, it was a wonderful time there in Italy. I loved it.
Knowing what you know now about art education, how was the education in Venice?
It was good. It was kind of one of those, it was an a la carte school where you could take little classes as you wanted to. So I only took one class, and it was pretty open. It wasn't an atelier system. They did have figure drawing classes and things there that I wasn't doing at the time. It was more just kind of art for non-art majors kind of thing, where I just was getting an introduction into it. They would do some little field trips around. But again, with some of the language barrier, I heard him talking about Cubismo, and I didn't know what Cuba had to do with anything. And it just seemed really bizarre, but Cubism obviously is what he was talking about. So it took me a while to kind of figure out what was going on. But so it was pretty, training wise, I can't talk a lot to the, the rigor of it or the types of trainings. It was a little more of an open kind of program for people, but so I don't want to talk it up too much, I'm sure it was better even than I wasn't taking a lot of the classes. So it was more about artistic influence.
The first real art school then beyond that you attended was BYU.
Actually, Weber State University, which is up in Ogden. I was there for 2 years. And then the program there was just a little more conceptual and contemporary, and I wasn't getting quite the representational, traditional skills that I needed. So then I did come here to BYU for 3 years to finish up my bachelor's in illustration.
Why were you drawn to representational and not the more contemporary?
I think it just allowed me to tell stories more directly and powerfully. I think I've had a real desire from the beginning to tell stories, and I think that's maybe one of the reasons why I've come back to largely agricultural themes now, is just wanting to tell that story of my youth and of my heritage and what was important to me that way. And so whether it was, desire to work on children's books for time, or desire to be in the animation industry, or desire to be teaching that now illustratively, as well as doing some gallery work in agricultural subjects, I think it just, we learn as people through narrative, and wanting to have that be a part of my work. I think illustratively, traditional skills or representational work was the vehicle for that I think was most powerful. Now, having said that, there's obviously a lot of abstract elements within representational art, and that can span a huge gap, or not gap, but a breadth between uber tight and really loose. So I think there's a lot. There's not just one place at the table stylistically, but for me, representational art has seemed to do that best.
Now, what about the students? Because obviously, if they're in an illustration program, they're probably representational, but you have access to students. You're talking to them every day. What is it that they're thinking about? What is it that's on their minds related to art? What can we learn from them?
Oh boy, I think they're obviously wanting to make a living at it, right? To be able to support themselves in the future that way. But as you also know, nobody gets into art with the goal of just purely making money. That's just a secondary concern to allow you to continue doing what you love. So I think I see in students a lot of just wanting to find joy in creation, that almost this kind of deep-seated passion to create that often they don't even fully understand yet, but they just feel this drive to do it. And so that's really fun to see their passion for it and see how much they have grown up, especially in this digital age, being content consumers. And they are excited to be creating that content. And they're really creating and making connections between disciplines of story and narrative. They just understand these tools even a lot better than I did when I was that age, for sure. So that's really exciting to see how much breadth and just kind of interdisciplinary mindset they come with already.
Well, as I talk to some of the earlier illustrators, people who kind of cut their teeth on illustration 20 or 30 or 40 years ago, a lot of them said that their lives as illustrators changed dramatically when the computer came around. Now, of course, you're fully digital. You've got a digital generation there. How much are these students learning? Are they doing figure drawing? Are they doing hand-to-eye coordination? Are they working with pencils and paint? Are they strictly working on iPads and with Wacom tablets?
Well, we do both, and in our program here at BYU, we really feel strongly about traditional training still. Some of their illustration programs have kind of gone away from that, but in sometimes in favor of just purely thinking about ideas or editorial conceptual work. But we still feel really strongly that learning to draw from the figure, observational drawing, traditional skills are going to be the best thing that you can do training-wise to then free you up to have the tools to go where you want to go. And you may be more stylized, you may go into film or may do more stylized work or even abstract work. But yeah, that traditional training's core. So we do a lot from the very beginning. We start with the traditional figure drawing and things like that. So we're pushing that a lot. We start oil painting early, and we're always crafting our curriculum to be even stronger that way. We're working in a stronger landscape context into things, so that's really been fun to be able to bring that to it. But then also realizing that digital skills are vital. And I feel really strongly, just personally, that digital painting it's just a tool. It doesn't make you a good painter or a bad painter. It just enhances really whatever you can do normally. So I don't see kids coming. Some of them, they've been on computers their whole lives, but they're still terrified of the computer because it just seems so overwhelming. And so it's been fun to be able to bring that and help them realize the potential of it as a tool and not something to be afraid of. But to your question, I guess we do focus heavily on traditional skills, but we also have a really strong digital component. And in fact, the animation program here at BYU was just voted the #1 in the nation of animation programs. And so a lot of our students feed into that and help make student films with the animation students. And I have animation kids that come and take my landscape classes. And so there's a lot of interconnection between those that's really fun.
Very exciting. Are these kids going out and plein air painting? You teaching them to paint outdoors yet?
I do, yeah. Beginning now at the sophomore level, we take them out. We have a lot of plein air easels that we've kind of bought a little bit at a time, and then some of them will buy their own as well and go out a few times a week and paint from life, and then bring it back in and also do some digital painting with that as well, saying, okay, here's your plein air piece. Now, what would you do if you could digitally paint over the top of it and enhance it? What changes would you make? How would you adjust the composition and fix things? And helping them to take those skills into concept design, into children's books, into gallery painting in increased ways. So it's fun to use it as a tool, a base like figure drawing for wherever they're going to go.
I got to believe that the great masters of all time would have been tinkering with an iPad and with a digital pen, pencil, whatever, and playing with it. I mean, I find it fascinating. I have that, and I spend a lot of time drawing on my iPad, and especially if I'm on airplanes and I'm bored. And I think it's a wonderful tool, and it's a great way to work on composition. But I also think some people are doing some incredible output from these. You look at Mike Hernandez, a fellow animator. His work is phenomenal. He obviously does traditional watercolors as well, but he's incredible. And so I think you're right. It's just a tool, and we shouldn't look down on that stuff. I think we use the tools we're given at the time. I'm sure that there's evidence now. Even Bouguereau had some photographs of his models. Whether or not he used them, we don't know. But fascinating. So you went from there to the Academy of Art University. Is that right?
I did. Yeah.
And you got
I freelanced for a year in between there, enough to realize I needed some more skills. So then I went to the Academy and loved it there. Did an MFA and spent 2 years there. In fact, met my wife there, and we got married and then moved here back and lived on the farm while I completed my thesis project for my MFA, which was some big murals on our family barn.
Oh, cool.
So I kind of illustrated some scenes of the early ancestors that had homesteaded the farm back in the 1880s and put those up as much an engineering challenge as it was an artistic challenge. And they're largely fading now, but they're still firm up on the barn. So it was really fun to do.
Oh, sounds like a lot of fun. So who did you study with in San Francisco?
Bill Mon, and then Xiaoming Wu as well, Warren Chang, Mark Tennant, and a few others. So it was, really, really a great training. And I liked there at the Academy that they really combined, in a lot of ways, the illustration and fine art training together. And so it was fun to be able to be painting in the cubicle next to a different artist who had a completely different approach to it, but yet it was all really the same principles you were dealing with. So it was a great training. I really, really enjoyed it. In fact, it was like what I had always wanted as far as learning landscape painting from Bill Mon. I don't know if you remember, you've probably seen movies or heard stories of like little boys back in the day huddled around the outside fences of famous ball fields, just trying to get a glimpse of their heroes as they were up at the plate.
Right.
And it was like that for me. We had a grad studio where they taught classes in a big parking garage, and they had partitions on wheels that they would kind of wheel around to make classes separated. And I remember just sitting with my eye and ear to the crease of the of the class that Bill Mon was teaching, just hanging on every word that he would say when I wasn't in the class yet, about atmospheric perspective and about applying paint and the different ways of thinking about color. And it just really changed the way that I approached art. So that was really fun.
Oh, that's exciting. Well, what a great opportunity to be a part of that. There's some great people that have come out of there and some fabulous instructors as well. So
yeah, it really was.
You became an animator, and I'm curious about how animation translates to painting, and maybe even specifically plein air painting.
Sure. Well, I would back up and say I didn't become an animator. I just went to work for an animation studio.
Oh, okay.
So, right. So it's kind of one of the unfortunate parts of the industry that it gets named after that, and then everybody says, "Oh, you're an animator." Like, no, I'm not an animator. So I was a color designer. I got hired just based on my landscape paintings, actually. And I didn't have anything digital. I just took a bunch of landscape paintings and took them in, actually prints of them. And they said, well, if you can understand natural light enough to paint in oils, you can paint digitally and that'll work. So plein air painting has a long history within animation of those early background painters that would go out and paint on location and then bring that information in. Walt Disney had one of his really core tenets was that he wanted to make films, not just cartoons. And so he wanted to endow his movies with a realism of life. And so his animators were, for Snow White, were looking at actual deer that they brought into the studio, or I should say that was Bambi. But for Bambi and Snow White, they would bring in models and they would figure draw and they would draw from the animals so that they could have this realism that was very different from what had ever been done before, because cartoons were just kind of silly stick figures before that. And that was translated into the backgrounds as well. There's a great video online called 4 Artists Paint a Tree. It's a famous kind of Disney video of these 4 different, Ivan Earl and a couple other artists that went out and plein air painted, and to look at the different results from their kind of stylistic interpretation of what they're looking at. So from the very beginning, it was a powerful part of it. And, none of us think, oh, well, somebody just made up Snow White. Like, we can get that they looked at a model. They actually recorded her film-wise doing a lot of the action and then would look at that as reference as they animated it. But we also sometimes think, oh, well, the landscape people, they just made up those backgrounds. Like, no, they were in the same way going and looking from life and then bringing that information to bear. So that was really how I got into it, was as from a fine artist kind of perspective, and then learned how to do that digitally. I mean, that's just learning the tool, but the tool also really helped me to make a ton of artistic progress, just because I was being forced to confront visual problems that I wouldn't have wouldn't have faced on my own, right? And so I didn't get to choose what time of day it was in the movie, or where the light was hitting, or what the light direction or atmospheric conditions were. They would tell you that, and then you had to figure out how to make it happen. So that was a chance where I really got to work through a lot of iteration and look at a lot of reference, trying to figure it out artistically, and being forced into those situations that helped me to grow and understand natural light in a new way. But then just being surrounded by other artists that were at the top of their game really, really helped me kind of level up a ton. And being able to have one of your other friends come over and say, how would you solve this problem? And they'll take the stylus pen and paint over it digitally for a minute and say, oh, this is probably what I would do. But just that kind of collaborative environment was really powerful.
What a wonderful opportunity.
Yeah, it really was. And most of the other artists too, they all had, they either did plein air work, or they would on the weekends or at nights do their own illustration work or fine art work. So everybody had kind of a passion for creation as well. One of the other things I would do is just go out every week and plein air paint. And so I'd take a long lunch, and sometimes people would come with me, sometimes they wouldn't. And I would just go out and paint around the studio. And so just that, how would I say, just being very kind of scheduled and religious about going out every week really changed the way that I painted. And some of that, frankly, came from having our first baby, when I couldn't do work on Saturdays as much as I had been doing painting-wise, or at night, because we were exhausted, and because my wife was taking care of our little one and needed help. And so it forced me to look for other opportunities to create and to learn and grow. And so where I'd been doing one large piece every few months and just laboring it, suddenly I couldn't do that, but I did do a piece or two every week. And I got a lot better really quickly.
So you would return to the same location multiple times?
No, more so I would just go to a different spot every week. But I guess that's my point, is that a lot of small starts helps me improve a lot quicker than just one laborious painting from a photo every few months. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So how much do you get out and PleinAir paint now?
I try to every week. It depends on the time. Sometimes when classes are crazy or I've got a big gallery show coming up or another freelance project for concept design, depending on deadlines, I can't get out every week, but I try every Friday morning to go.
Great discipline.
Yeah, and I found there at Blue Sky too, like I couldn't wait for the weather to be good. Like if I just said, well, okay, let's go Thursday, and then if the weather's good, then people would have deadlines and say, oh, well, it's raining today, let's go out Friday. And then Friday comes and everybody's busy, and so it just gets kicked down the road and it never happens.
Yeah.
So I finally had to say, okay, I'm going out Wednesday at 12 o'clock. Anybody who wants to come, that's great, but I'm going then. Yeah. And whether it's raining or snowing, if it's snowing, I'll just go stand under a bridge and paint, whatever I do. And that really made a difference too.
I think that's the right attitude, because otherwise you'd always find an excuse.
Yeah, totally.
So talk to me about some of the training principles. You're teaching illustration, but for the PleinAir painters, and it's hard to articulate verbally some of these things which you could take a pencil or a paintbrush and show, but what are some of the things that maybe you teach or you possess that we might not necessarily find out there from other instructors? You know, is there a different way that you approach it? I noticed, for instance, one thing, I was looking at your website, and you do some fabulous things in shadow. You know, I find that to be one of the hardest things to do, is to get the sense of depth in the shadows, but you have entire buildings in shadow with hardly any light showing, and yet they come alive. I just think that's one of the hardest things for an artist to do. What are some of the things that you maybe are teaching that we could learn from?
Oh boy. Well, I don't know that I can claim anything that any monopoly on knowledge that others don't have, but I know for me, some of the things I've focused on is just composition. And I early on, as I've been teaching here at BYU, I've realized that teaching full time and trying to do other kind of freelance work as well, like my time's really limited, and I don't have the time to compete with others with brush time as far as creating a beautiful painting on the surface. And so I knew that I wasn't going to be able to outpaint somebody in just pure luscious brush strokes, right? So I felt like, okay, if I can't outpaint somebody, maybe I can, I don't know, I don't want to make it a competition, but I felt like I can get more mileage out of focusing on composition than I can out of purely focusing on surface quality of paint, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And so I felt like, okay, let me focus on composition, and then my paint quality and how I paint it can come along the way. I'll kind of drag that along with me, and it'll improve as I go. So I feel very strongly like it's important to tell a story with your work, and to, even though it may be very, abstract, the story you're telling, it's not just about saying, well, there's this person here and there's a dog and there's this, but just thinking of an idea, like having a big theme is really going to make a bigger difference in your work than just saying, well, I would just want to paint this pretty thing or this tree or whatever it is. So really having an idea, a goal in mind, and then trying to solve that problem, whether it's a quality of light, whether it is trying to tell what you think is beautiful about this scene. I find that really focusing in on that is really vital. And you see that in film, animated film, and you see it in paintings, that when somebody really has decided what the story is they're trying to tell, then it's powerful and they can communicate real universal truth. But when they don't know what they're trying to tell and they're just kind of they're kind of getting lost in the weeds of the medium, then it gets confusing both in a film and in a gallery painting or in a plein air piece or whatever.
So how do you get
really
there?
editing? I think you really work on verbalizing what you're trying to do, right? Of not just saying, okay, here's everything that I want to paint, and I'm just looking at this whole mountain and I'm trying to do every tree that I look at. It's kind of taking a step back and taking a deep breath and saying, okay, what is interesting to me about this? Is it the quality of the light? Like, what drew me to this in the first place? And then just being over time practicing editing down and letting the other details go. So looking at the big picture and just trying to get that essence down. And for me, that comes in not trying to do a finished piece on location. Some people love that, and they do amazing work at that, and I really respect that. But for me, it's hard to just take a huge canvas and try and do a finished piece on location. I seem to get lost in the details too much. So for me, I really like to keep it small and set a time limit and just try and get the essence of what I'm looking at. Because when you set a time limit, it forces you to edit. You can't possibly put everything in at that point. So you have to decide what story you're trying to tell. And so for me, doing those quick studies help me to then come into the studio, and then I can start to have more of a chess match with what's going on in developing a bigger composition of that.
So how small is this piece typically when you're outdoors?
Josh Clare does this too. He'll tape off a big panel where maybe I'll take an 11 by 14 and tape it off into 4 quadrants. Sometimes we'll do a 12 by 16 and tape it into 6 little panels. So a little smaller than 6 by 8, maybe 4 by 5 inches. And then use a bigger brush and just give myself half an hour, 45 minutes. Because after that, things are changing quite a bit. And when I was doing bigger pieces like 9 by 12s and 11 by 14s on location, I found that I was spending 3-4 hours on location. And then I would come back in and I would labor the painting a little bit more while it was still wet. And then at that point, I'd really solved the problem or beat it to death, one of the two. And there was no reason to go bigger. So it kept me from painting big, doing that medium size on location and trying to do finished paintings on location. Once I made it smaller, tried to get the essence and then come back in, there was still something to explore, and it allowed me to then explore ideas in a bigger canvas. And Scott Christensen really was one of the ones that helped me to do that when I had a workshop from him. And he talked about just trying any way you can to not finish a painting on location, even if you have to use a scrap panel that's an awkward size that's not square. Like, do whatever you can to just not make it precious. Because when location is about learning, not finishing, for me anyway. So,
well, I think the other thing
I
tend to paint about 9 by 12 is my standard, but the thing that frustrates me, and maybe you've just solved a problem, is that I go to a place and I see 3 or 4 things that I want to crank out in a day, and to crank out 3 or 4 9 by 12s and do them well, it seems a bit much. But to paint by 6 by 8 or something, go in and get color notes and shapes and just the essence down in 30 minutes each, you could pump out a lot of them.
Yeah, you can. And so sometimes I'll come home with half a dozen or more sketches from a location. And I found that most of the artists that I really respect are doing similar things. Now, some that I really respect do large paintings on location and they love it. But generally, like, they're using location as a classroom. And then they're using the studio as a finishing session, as a performance space. And so anyway, for me, that's helped. And it's one of the reasons why plein air competitions sometimes are a little hard for me, because I go to them sometimes and it is fine and I enjoy it, but trying to do a finished painting on location is a very different mindset to me from trying to study on location.
Right.
And consequently, why I find a lot of plein air painters don't make a lot of progress as much as they would like is because they're trying to do finished paintings. They're trying to perform on location. And if they just gave themselves permission to study on location, that takes a lot of pressure off, and you approach it differently. And then you can take that into the studio and learn a lot more.
Talk to me about color. I'm noticing that it seems to me that most of your color, even though it feels very bright, is pretty muted. In other words, I get the impression that you have you use very little brilliant color to create the sense of really bright color. But maybe I'm wrong. Are you graying things down? What's your philosophy on color?
I kind of have two philosophies on it. Number one is on location. I find that if I'm not careful, and this is from experiencing my tendencies over time, once I bring it back into the studio, usually what I've done on location feels more desaturated and darker than I thought it was on location, right? Because you have all this great, beautiful natural light bouncing around outside, and it makes you think that you're being a wild man with color.
Especially
and then
in
you
the
bring
snow.
it inside, and you're like, yeah. And then you bring it inside, and you're like, oh, that's dead. And so I've learned that on location, usually I need to push up my saturation more than I think I see it by about 10%.
Really?
And then I find that once I come back inside, then that's usually about right, according to perception. And I've learned over time that I've usually need to pull up my values by about, again, 10, 15% on location, to where then when I come inside, they sit a little darker and they feel okay. Which is why I hardly ever paint with full sunlight if I can help it, because then it really does crazy things with your values and you just do really dark paintings. But so to answer your question, I do usually saturate up a little bit when I'm on location. And then when I go larger, usually I pull it down a little bit, because I find that once you expand that saturation on a large scale, it has a bigger impact. And so I usually try and push it down a little bit more. And part of that just is I like the closeness of harmonies and of really subtle color shifts. And I feel like that works really well on a larger scale, something that feels a little more subdued. But I definitely wouldn't there's some painters who go really like almost just grayscale, and I wouldn't consider myself that per se. I do love the idea of like pushing saturation in shadows, so that then you can really desaturate your lights and it still feels bright. So it's those transitions between shadow and light that you can crank, and then your lights you can totally pull back in, almost sometimes go very grayscale, and it will still feel really bright.
So are you talking about where the shadow meets the light, putting a higher chroma there?
Right. Mm-hmm. And you see that in nature all the time. You look at a shadow and you're going to see that really strong warm right at the edge of that shadow as it transitions in. And once it comes out into the full sunlight, it's going to desaturate down. So just looking at other kind of artists that I really admire, both historically and contemporary, and seeing that that's a lot of what seems to make something glisten and feels really exciting to me is how I do it. But by that same token, there's like Colin Page is a main artist who does amazing like high chroma paint in a way that I never would dream of doing, but he controls it and it's beautiful. So there's not one right way, but for me, the kind of pulling back on larger pieces has made more sense to me.
Something I don't think we've ever talked about on the PleinAir podcast, but something you're a master at accomplishing are edges. Talk to our audience about edges, because you do them beautifully.
Well, thank you very much. To me, that comes down to two things. Number one, focal point, of using edges as a means of creating a focal point and of allowing things to be softer where you don't want the viewer to look. And then also it's a means for me of, what would I say, just process that as I'm going along and repainting certain sections and trying to solve the problem, kind of organic edges just happen a little bit more. And so I think it's a lot of fun. That's funny you mentioned that, because I feel like there's others who I really respect who do that really well. And I feel like I'm just starting to understand that principle a little bit. But then sometimes you just do it because it's fun, right? There's something really exciting about that. I forget who said it, but you want your paintings to work at two scales, right? You want to draw someone in, make someone want to walk across the room to look at it, and then reward them for the trip once they get there.
Great line.
And far too often I find that somebody across the room, I'll get drawn in by a piece, but then the closer I get, the more it falls apart.
Yeah.
And it just doesn't have the interest to keep me there. So I think edges are one of those things that really help you, as well as kind of the surface quality of paint and things like that help make somebody excited once they get up close. And that magic that happens when something loosens up the closer we get to it, and then you step back and it just sings together, for me is really exciting. One of the ways I try and do that is I try and purposely just walk back and forth between my painting a lot and really try and paint it from about 10 feet back, right? And then walk up, make a few strokes, walk back, observe it a little bit. It should feel right from 10 feet back. And far too often we paint our paintings just sitting in a chair or standing right close to it, and it feels great when you're right up in front of it, but you step back and it just falls apart. So I want kind of that duality of excitement and surface.
Interesting. Now you have, oh gosh, what was I going to say? I completely lost it. See, next thing you know, I'll be getting hearing aids.
Well, often the beauty of edges is just overcome by it. That's good. The other thing I was going to ask you, I remember now, is that I think a lot of people find architecture very difficult, so they avoid it. Have you learned, you do architecture beautifully. You do these decrepit old barns, which look like they're a lot of fun to paint. But there's, sometimes architecture just falls apart for some people. Is there anything to it that you've picked up? Is it about edges? What is it about? For me, it's really about like the first assignment you ever did in art school, which was they gave you like a cube and they put it on the table and put a lamp on it and said, draw that cube. That's all that a barn is in a structure. Any structure is really just a cube with light from a focal area on it, and just is a little more complex, but really it's about perspective drawing, like learning how to draw a basic shape in 3 dimensions. And figure drawing in many ways is similar, maybe a little more complex, but yeah, learning how to draw a cube in perspective is vital. And so many artists don't know perspective, and so they just try and make it up, and then things just don't add up where they're going back to the horizon. And I find that that's a skill that is largely kind of ignored in a lot of art programs anymore. And so people just don't know how to do it. But yeah, perspective is key. If you can get something to sit in space with perspective, then you can have a lot of crazy edges. You can be use a lot of expression, I should say, and it will still hold together. And barns are great too, because they're already falling down a little bit, so you can kind of be a little more interpretive with, or just let things be a little more floppy, but still it's got to sit in space. How
much teaching do you do? Outside of the school.
Not a lot. I find that it's so full time that by the little time I do have extra usually goes into painting. And so I've had a lot of people ask about workshops and things, but it just has been hard to kind of negotiate that while still trying to do other freelance work too. Yeah. Now, having said that, maybe every couple of years I'll do a workshop, and it might be something that could be really great. I think there probably is some interest out there.
What do you think the key is to getting the most out of a workshop?
I think you need to decide whether you want to be comfortable or whether you want to grow, and you got to choose one, because you can't do both. And far too many students, they say they want to grow, but really they just want to be comfortable, or they want someone to praise them. And once you can let that go and allow yourself to be uncomfortable and be in a place where you're trying new things, like powerful things can happen. And so as far as workshops go, I find that being willing to kind of set your pride aside and leave that at home in the studio, whether you're a beginner or an experienced painter, like you are not there to perform so they can tell you you're good. You're there to learn. And that may mean like being willing to paint like this person for a week to try on as much as you can of how they're seeing the world, And then you can go home and you can decide what you want to keep and what you don't want to. But if you're there and you don't want someone to paint on your painting and you don't want to really change the way that you're doing things, like, why are you there? So I think just coming with an openness to be willing to learn what they're doing. And then also I would say, especially for beginners, really study a lot of kind of beginning art principles on your own, both perspective drawing and other types of drawing. I find if you can come well armed with some better drawing skills to a workshop, then the painter can really help you kind of move to the next level. But far too often, too much of workshops I find are spent with beginning artists that just don't even know the basics of perspective drawing or how to draw a still life or just value and things, to where then they spend most of the time struggling with those things.
Yeah, in their defense,
they're never.
In their defense, nobody's told them to do those things in advance,
Yeah,
and
exactly.
they just show up and hope that somebody's going to teach them how to paint, which makes a lot of sense.
Totally.
So a lot of us are not able to have the gift of art school, illustration school, Academy of Art, etc. What's your best advice on how to grow as a painter if you never went to art school?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that, because to your point a minute ago, like, not a lot of people haven't done that, so they don't know how to do perspective, or they don't know how to do that. It's not something they're just not doing on purpose, but they just haven't known it. And fortunately, we live in an age where there's so much content out there, more than there's ever been. And so there's great online options that you just never had. Most artists have, even if they have a paid video, you can either obviously buy that DVD or rent one from the library, or go online and probably see a shortened version of it. And so there's just a lot of information out there that when I was going through school, even just 20 years ago, we just didn't have. So I feel like more than ever, it's not the problem of having enough information. It's just being able to have the time to do it, as well as the focus to make use of it.
Excellent.
So, yeah, those are some things I would say.
Good.
But also I would say, if you don't, like, the challenge of not being in school is that you don't have someone else come challenging you with problems, right? Like really what school does is that it poses questions to you that you normally would not pose to yourself. And on your own, the tendency is to just be where you're comfortable and to say, well, I like to paint this, I'm just going to paint this thing. And it feels, when you go to a workshop, then it feels uncomfortable because they're asking questions that you don't ask. But that's also the reason why a workshop is great. So I find you having an art group and having other people look at your work, and maybe you give assignments to each other, but some way to force you consistently and out of your comfort zone, and to try new things, and then have other people that can help give some information, whether it's critique or feedback or things that you wouldn't be able to get on your own.
Good advice. Well, David, the time has gone by very rapidly, but this has been an absolute pleasure. Do you have any final thoughts for everybody?
Oh boy, just find joy in it, right? Like, for me, art is a means to an end, right? I believe firmly that when we create that, and when we are part of that creation, that this is this gift that God has given us to be able to understand more about Him as a creator, more about ourselves, and more about life and the world around us. And it's this thing of joy that sometimes when we just get stuck in the minutia of the learning and the tools along the way, we can sometimes forget that this is here to help us be better people, that it's here to serve us in our journey to progress as people and as fellow humans in our journey of life, rather than feeling like sometimes that we're serving this taskmaster of art and there's something that we have to serve that way. Where we just need to stop sometimes and back up and say, okay, like, how can I use this to benefit my life and to bless the lives of others, and enjoy the journey along the way. Don't wait till the end to find joy in it.
Great interview. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Eric. It's been a real pleasure to be with you, and look forward to chatting again soon.
Well, thank you again to David Dibble. I'm really honored to have him. He's just really, really just fabulous. Love his work. You can check it out at his website. If you're ready for some marketing ideas, I'm ready to give them.
This is the Marketing Minute with Eric Rhodes, author of the #1 Amazon bestseller, Make More Money Selling Your Art, Proven Techniques to Turn Your Passion into Profit.
In the Marketing Minute, I try to answer your marketing questions, which you can email me anytime, eric@pleinairmagazine.com. This comes from Esther Luca of Ronda, Spain. Ah, cool. She says, I think it's harder for artists to make a living in Europe than it is in America. Can you tell me how I can make my paintings sell in America? I don't have a clue. I don't know if it's harder. I think sometimes the grass is always greener, right? We think it's not as good in our area, but it may just be the way you're doing things. Maybe your marketing, maybe the way you're putting yourself out there. I don't know if it's true or not, but it probably is to some extent anyway. People who love paintings, people who buy paintings, they're the same everywhere, I would think. So you may just have to do some marketing different. I mean, I think that sometimes the economy ebbs and flows. So like if you're in an area with a bad economy, maybe they're not buying paintings, but you maybe got to market in an area with a good economy. That's why in America, I always talk about if you're in a couple galleries, make sure you're in one gallery where the economy is really strong or where tourism's really strong. Esther, you can take advantage of the mystique. Being from Spain seems exotic to those of us here in America. And I would think that galleries love the idea of saying this person's from France or Spain or something. So you might want to start thinking about marketing in America, talk to some galleries and so on so they can market you. But remember, the world is small today. You can get your work out there on Instagram and Facebook and other things, and nobody has to know where you're from. I'm going to be teaching Instagram marketing one morning at the PleinAir convention. And the key to Instagram marketing, and then there's many, but there's an 80-20 rule, 80% content, 20% asking or selling. And so don't overdo it. And so you just want to kind of build your reputation there. But, you can't really control who's there. You don't know if they're collectors or followers or just other artists, not just other artists, but other artists. So just be keeping that in mind. If you want to get into an environment where you're pretty much guaranteed to sell, then you want to be in an environment where people are there to buy. For instance, a magazine like mine, Fine Art Connoisseur or PleinAir, people are there to buy. People track artists, they watch them over time, and they eventually will, if they like them, they'll eventually buy something. The key to all marketing, though, the principles are always the same. You've got to find a platform where the money is hiding, right? I always say stand in the river where the money is flowing. Something that collectors or known art buyers are going to spend time with, which tends to be, like art shows, art gallery openings, art magazines, art websites, but more focused on art buyers, things that focus on art buyers and art collectors. So I also like to go where the big money is, because big money is not as sensitive if the economy crashes, and the economy always crashes at some point. So big money might not spend $500,000 on a painting. They might only spend $50,000 on a painting. But small money, they just stop buying. And so I like to be where big money is. And that's why Fine Art Connoisseur is like, we've got like 300 billionaires that read it. So it's pretty cool. Anyway, you want to be seen frequently. People believe that advertising is content. In other words, they see your ads of your paintings, they feel like it's content. That's not true in all magazine advertising, but it's very true in an art magazine. And concentrate on dominating a single audience, right? So like if you spread yourself too thin, you say, I'll do a little here and a little there and a little over there, then you're not getting enough frequency typically unless you can really afford it. So get where you can get a lot of frequency, where you can be there all year, every issue, multiple times over, 3, 4, 5 years. That's how you build a reputation. It takes time and commitment. I have artists that I helped start marketing 5 years ago who are household brands today at least in the art communities, that nobody ever heard of 5 years ago. It's because they're just out there and they're consistent. It's not for the faint of heart. It's not easy, but I hope this helps anyway. Next question comes from Julian C. of Atlanta, Georgia. Eric, he says, I love listening to you when I paint. I was sitting here wondering the other day how I can do this full time. I work as a manager at a tire store and my back hurts. Yeah, I get it. I can't keep doing this. My goal is to be a full-time artist in 5 years, but I don't know where to start. And I'm in my mid-40s, so I can't retire anytime soon, and I'll be giving up what retirement income I have. What would you do? You know, Julian, follow what you love. If you follow what you love, you're always going to find a way. It isn't always easy. I'm not saying it's going to be easy. You know, there's a TV host by the name of Steve Harvey. I saw a video of him the other day, and somebody asked him kind of the question, how do you succeed? And he says, you have to jump. You have to take a leap of faith. You have to jump off. He said, you're going to see others who have had success. You'll see people with nice cars and big houses and big money, and maybe those things are important to you. Maybe they're not. Maybe it's just about making a living. But he said, when you see that, don't get discouraged when it's not you. Your time will come. You know, they may have, you don't know what they've gone through to get there. He says, their parachute opened. They jumped, their parachute opened. He said, you jump. You might fall and fall and fall and have a lot of mishaps and hit some rocks and bump your head, but you're going to eventually make it. But if you don't jump, you'll never make it. You're never going to get your parachute open if you don't jump. So I thought that was pretty good advice. And so I think, you know, the whole idea is I like to make plans. I don't just jump. I mean, sometimes I take risks, but I don't just jump. I think you need to be a student of marketing. I would study marketing like crazy for a year. Just study it, buy everything you can, read everything you can, study. Start trying it. Marketing makes the difference. There are painters that have never been heard of that are brilliant that'll never be seen or heard of because they don't do any marketing. There are great painters in the world from the past. You know, Monet was a great marketer. He was a brilliant marketer. So, and look how famous he is now. He's dead, but he's famous. Anyway, build yourself what I call a 4 or 5 year plan. Start working the plan, edge into it. The goal is to start selling while you still have your job. Start selling, get good at it, ramp it up so that by the time you're ready to quit your job, the time you're ready to quit your job, I think, is when you've replaced your income. So now you're making double the income, right? Because you've got your painting income and you've got your job income. When you've got double the income, now you can start putting a little money away so that you have money for a rainy day, because it's nice to have 6 months or a year, if you possibly can, put away. And then, you know, once you've got some money put away, then I think it's okay to pull the plug. And maybe a friend of mine did this. He went from a full-time job and he went to a part-time with the same company. And then he went to a consulting, reducing his time a little bit year after year. And then eventually he went out full-time doing art, and he was teaching and workshops and, you know, whatever it was to bring in money. And so that's kind of the way you do it. You edge into it. So anyway, I hope that helps. Of course, you got to get good at being a painter too. So you want to be doing workshops, you want to be studying videos, you want to do anything you can to make sure that you're constantly improving your work, because you're out there among others who are doing the same thing. You got to compete. So hope that's been a good answer for you. Thank you. I appreciate the question. Maybe I'll see you in the Adirondacks. You can look it up at publishersinvitational.com to come to the Adirondacks. If you've not seen my Sunday morning blog, check it out. It's called Sunday Coffee. It's free, comes to your email every week. You just have to sign up for it, and you can do that at coffeewitheric.com. Always fun doing the podcast. Love this. Love talking to great artists like David. Let's do it again sometime like next week. I'll see you then. My name is Eric Rhodes. I'm the publisher and the founder of PleinAir magazine. You can find it on the newsstands if you're just hearing this for the first time. Remember, it's a great big world out there, and it needs to be painted. So go paint it. Bye-bye.
This has been the PleinAir Podcast with PleinAir Magazine's Eric Rhodes. You can help spread the word about plein air painting by sharing this podcast with your friends. And you can leave a review or subscribe on iTunes so it comes to you every week. And you can even reach Eric by email, eric@pleinairmagazine.com. Be sure to pick up our free ebook, 240 plein air painting tips by some of America's top painters. It's free at pleinairtips.com. Tune in next week for more great interviews. Thanks for listening.